Wow, very responsive. Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. If you would, let's have the Pledge of Allegiance, and we're going to have an invocation by Marshall Howden.
To the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Bow your heads with me, please. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this evening and the opportunity to gather together in fellowship as citizens and like-minded individuals as we continue to march forward and make the decisions that will be beneficial to the future of our city and economic development and the like. We ask you to give us the gift of wisdom and discernment tonight as we make these decisions, and give us an open heart as we listen to the citizens and our fellow aldermen as we try to make these important decisions. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Thank you, Marshall. Madam Clerk, can we get a roll call, please?
LeBlanc, Rodriguez, Howden, Milton, Cooper,
Here.
Denham, Fenton.
Here.
Your Honor, you have a quorum.
Thank you.
And this is a training related to Missouri Economic Development Incentives.
Well, I say we start off with Mr. Joe Lauber. You have anything to share with us this evening?
Just a little.
We're listening.
Just a little. Let's see here. So, can you advance it, or do I need to advance it?
I can do it
Okay, we'll get through last night's. There we go. All right, now it's tonight's. Okay, good evening, Mayor, members of the board. Appreciate your time on back-to-back evenings. I know it's tough. We already have a lot of meetings that we attend, but I appreciate you being back tonight to discuss the important topic of economic development incentive policies for the city of Branson. I hope that you are all still energized and ready to think about what goals the city should set for itself to keep Branson vibrant and flourishing for years to come, based off of last night's initial discussion. As was mentioned last night, tonight's meeting will be as educational as I hope last night's meeting was inspirational. We will be going through in some detail how cities are authorized to use certain economic development tools, how they work, and some examples of uses that other cities have made of these tools to achieve their goals, so that you have some additional ideas for how you can help to reach Branson's goals. Also, as was mentioned last night, Branson has an existing economic development policy. It addresses all of the tools that we will discuss tonight, and your policy does discuss a couple incentives that are not going to be covered this evening. One is a special business district, and the other is enhanced enterprise zones. And primarily, these two tools I'm not going to talk about tonight is because special business districts, they're kind of similar to a CID, but they have even less power. So we're going to go at CID, and then you pretty much have the concepts of special business district. EEZ, they are still in existence, but the state of Missouri kind of closed out that program several years ago. They're still out there. You can still have some benefits for them, but it's not something that's been pressed by the state, so that's one I'm going to leave out as well. Additionally, I will note that your policy does mention some tools that are outside the city's jurisdiction to approve or administer, but are instead approved and administered by state or federal authorities. Based on last night's discussion and especially the discussion on opportunity zones, what I would propose is that we will put an addition into that section of your policy when the revised copy comes out to identify the opportunity zones which were not in existence at the last time that your policy was updated. So we'll make sure that that's added based on last night's discussion. So we have a lot to cover this evening, so let's dive in. This is kind of the list of stuff that we will walk through in detail this evening. These are what I affectionately refer to as the alphabet soup of Missouri economic development financing tools, primarily just because of those acronyms that they're all covered by. So we'll talk about TIF, which is tax increment financing. It's a blight remediation tool that utilizes both incremental increases in property tax revenues and sales tax revenues. We'll talk about CIDs. CIDs are they're a standalone entity. They can be formed as a political subdivision or as a nonprofit corporation and have different uses there. We'll talk about those. Transportation development districts are also a standalone political subdivision, but its approval in this case is done by the circuit court of the county in which the TDD is put in. We'll talk about that. CIDs are something that the Board of Aldermen actually controls, whether that can be created through an ordinance. NIDs are neighborhood improvement districts. While they sound a lot like CID or TDD, these are not separate political subdivisions at all. In fact, they're just an area of the city that is identified for improvements that would benefit primarily that area. And so the people in the area end up paying for the improvement because they're specially benefited from it, and so they pay a special assessment to pay for those. Jumping over to the right-hand column, we'll talk some about Chapter 100. Chapter 100 refers to the Missouri Revised Statutes section that you'll find, or the chapter that you find it in. And this deals primarily with industrial development, but we'll learn tonight that it goes much further beyond that and why. Chapter 353, another reference to the Missouri statutes. 353 is one of the earliest tools that we used in Missouri for blight remediation. It's the older brother or the father or maybe the grandfather of TIF. TIF, you'll see when we talk about TIF, we're going to go into that in some detail. But when you get to hear about 353, you'll hear some of the elements are the same. And so TIF took some of the concepts of 353 and expanded on those. And then the last topic that we'll talk about this evening will be sales tax reimbursement agreements. You guys are actually, somewhat familiar with those because we've actually just recently gone through an application that included a sales tax reimbursement approval. We'll talk about where the authority comes for that, what some of the limitations are, and so forth with respect to that. So with that, let's dive right on into tax increment financing. So I know that you all are, just bounding at the seams and ready to learn all about economic development incentives. So I'm going to tell you right where to find it in the Missouri statutes. It's either that, or if you have insomnia, you might go out and look here as well. But it is in section 99,800 through 99,866 of the Missouri Revised Statutes. Why do I keep going back to the statutes all the time? The reason is we're a fourth-class city. That is called a statutory city. Sometimes they're referred to as Dillon's Rule cities. I think we talked about this in maybe some of the trainings previously. Cities in Missouri do not have inherent powers unless they're a home rule charter city, okay? Home rule charter cities derive their power directly from the Missouri Constitution. Third class cities, can't think of any in the area. Sedalia, Missouri is one, for example, that's a third class city. I think, can't think of any other that are in the immediate area. And fourth class cities, which is there are more fourth class cities in Missouri than any other type of city, are referred to as statutory cities. And they derive their power from what statutes give them. So the General Assembly has to write a law in order for us to have a power. So if you come to your city attorney, you come to me, you come to Holly, and you ask, can Branson do this? Our first question is, I don't know, let's look to see if there's a statute that, usually we know, but we may have to go look it up to see if there's a statute, if there's any constitutional provision that prohibits it. And if there's a statute, did the case law interpret it one way or the other to determine whether you have the authority to do that? And really, tonight's presentation is talking about the statutes that the General Assembly has given us, and then in some cases, the case law that has interpreted, how then you utilize that. And that's how we get to, the details for tonight. So tax increment financing is designed to encourage redevelopment projects that will increase property value and economic activity in a specific area where development would not have occurred on its own. That's a mouthful, right? So there's a couple things that are important in that. So there are measurements that you will see as we go through TIF that talk about baseline taxes prior to TIF being adopted and what the values and the tax revenues that will be created after a project is done. It says that the project would not have occurred on its own. As I mentioned last night, there's a state law requirement in Missouri that you cannot approve a TIF project unless it would not have occurred but for the incentives, and there are some financial tests that you go through to do that. So procedurally, what happens is for TIF to occur, a city adopts a redevelopment plan to carry out redevelopment projects in a redevelopment area. I said redevelopment a lot in there, right? But those three terms that I laid out, actually we'll have a slide that kind of shows that in just a minute, that the plan is just like our policy setting. It's like, where are we headed with it? The redevelopment area lays down where the development will occur, and then the projects will talk about whether you can segment or phase some of the development that would occur within an area. And I've got a slide that kind of walks through that really well. One of the things I'll say just really quickly is when you read the TIF statute, again, for that either the excitement or the insomnia, when you read through it, what you would come away with is the idea is like, oh, well, this is supposed to be the city instigating this, okay? What I will tell you is that probably close to 95% of the time, TIF is not initiated by the city itself. It's usually a developer that has an idea, has an area in mind, and they come forward and they ask the city if the city would be willing to adopt their plan. And that's, the process that you go through the application process. Now, that's not to say that cities don't. What we usually call those speculative TIFs, and I have worked with some communities before that had an area of their city where they said, this area right here needs some development. We've never had anybody kick the tires. We've never had anybody interested in doing a project in this area, but this area really needs some lifeblood breathed into it. And the city can actually go through a process where you develop your own plan, and then you put out RFPs, or requests for proposals of the development community to see who has the best idea to fix it. And so I've got a project like that going right now in the city of Pleasant Valley, Missouri, up by the Ford plant in Kansas City, where they had an area. Nobody was coming to Pleasant Valley's aid, and so they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps and did a TIF, and they actually got a developer to respond on it, and they got a really neat project on the way now as a result. So that's something, one way you can use tax increment financing. So redevelopment of the TIF area will increase the equalized assessed valuation of the property. So again, the property value goes up, and so we'll talk about the fact, we talked a little bit last night about the fact that the tax rate doesn't go up. Taxes don't change. Taxes don't increase as a result of TIF. What increases is the value of the property. And we all know that when you apply the tax rate to a higher value, it generates more revenue, right? That's what it's all about. And so that's kind of the distinction there. And it's a common misperception that TIF is like, oh, you're gonna raise my taxes. Nope, 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 nope. Taxes will not go up. Taxes will stay the same. We've got the Hancock Amendment that says we can't increase taxes without a vote. There are essentially three types of TIF available. There's blight area, conservation area, economic development area. Most of the time, I will always tell my clients to go for the blight area. The General Assembly did make some changes in 2018 to the TIF Act since the last time you guys did a TIF, and they have changed the definition of blight, and they've also put some strong restrictions on greenfield area TIFs in Missouri, which you guys have not experienced yet. These changes at least. And so, we have to look at those a little differently than we did prior to 2018. Conservation areas are essentially pre-blight. And then there are economic development areas. If you remember back in, I think it was 2005, I think, the United States Supreme Court decided the Kelo decision. And that decision, essentially what it stands for very roughly, is the fact that it was a question about whether economic development itself is a public benefit, right? Why would they ask that question? Because as stewards of public funds, it's our responsibility to make sure that when we're spending tax dollars, there's a public benefit for it. There can always be some slight private benefit as well, but as long as overwhelmingly it's a public benefit, you can spend money on it. The Supreme Court in that case did decide that economic development is a public benefit. That case involved actual eminent domain. It was the taking of property for a public benefit. But when that decision came down and said that economic development is a public benefit, then, then it means that economic development is a public benefit for all things, including the expenditure of funds.
Hey, Joe.
Yes.
Since the 2018 ruling, does the threshold for blight, is it harder to reach or easier to reach?
It's harder to reach now. Yep. And the greenfield limitation is probably one of the biggest pieces of that. So, but we can talk about that in a little bit here. So what are the things that tax increment financing may finance? And I mentioned a little bit last night is, TIF, it's interesting in that once you've gone through the process, you've gone through the hoops and all of the requirements that the General Assembly has set for putting one together, then, once you've got one, then the revenues that are generated can be used for that no matter what their source. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail in just a minute. But you can finance land acquisition, you can finance infrastructure improvements, renovation, construction of buildings, even acquisition of machinery and equipment on that. I mentioned before, there is a statutory requirement that the project would not occur but for the incentives. And so that's why you will engage a financial consultant that will take a look at, usually an applicant will come in, again, it's their project, they'll come in and they'll say, we couldn't do this without. And so your financial analyst, what they will do is they'll check the numbers that your applicant is giving, and they'll compare those to national trends and national data that's out there to confirm that, they're not just saying it's really tough out there, but it's, they're sitting on a golden, egg or something. So, so that's what we're doing there. The funding mechanisms to support the financing of improvements essentially comes from two sources. The first is pilots, and that's an acronym for payments in lieu of taxes, okay? So I'm gonna give you a mnemonic, we're gonna go over it because we're gonna go through some little, exercises on this in a minute, but P, pilots, property taxes, right? So remember that side of it because the two sources of funding that come about through TIF deal with incremental increases in property tax revenues and sales tax revenues. And sales tax revenues are treated differently than property tax revenues in the calculation. So, when you have people that are, asking you questions in public and you're, like that, these are the types of things that you want to be like, okay, yeah, this is how this works, so you can help, provide, good information to constituents that maybe have questions on it. So pilots are the property tax revenue increases. EATs, there's no fancy mnemonic, that's why you have to focus on the property one, right? So EATs are the economic activity taxes. But if you think about what are economic activities, that's making the cash register ring. And so when you're making the cash register ring, we're talking about sales tax revenues, and so that's the sales tax revenue side of how TIF gets paid for. So when it all kind of comes together, you've got a plan, you've got projects, you've got costs, you've got revenues, you've got projected increases, and then you actually then produce incremental increases in property tax revenues and sales tax revenues. What happens is that money comes back to the city, and it's required to be put into a special fund that the city has to create for each project called a special allocation fund, or the SAF, okay? And the special allocation fund, like everybody always cringes when I say this, but it's like the special TIF washing machine, right? It's the, like we don't money launder, right? But TIF, if you think about it, when you generate revenues through this project and the revenues are created, the money that goes into the special allocation fund is TIF money. And again, so when I made the point last night, and I made it earlier tonight already, if you have parks tax revenue that is captured and goes into the special allocation fund, it no longer has to be used for parks. It can be used for anything TIF related, okay? And we're going to cover in just a second the fact that not all sales tax revenues get captured. So if you have a parks sales tax, every dollar that is generated by the project, half of it goes to the special allocation fund. The other half continues on to the city. That half has to be used for parks, okay? And so I'm using parks because it's kind of limited, and it's rare that we ever have a development that has a park in it. Maybe it'd be more, common here than anywhere else I deal with, but it's rare, okay? General fund sales taxes, capital improvement sales taxes, transportation also deal with things that could be, could be part of a TIF project, and so sometimes the non-captured revenues get used there. So again, this, the special allocation fund, and they can be used to, so once that money is collected into the special allocation fund, then that is where, from there, it can go to reimburse the developer if they're being paid on a pay-as-you-go basis, right? Or that money can be used to pay the debt service on bonds, okay? This is all money that the project has created. It didn't exist before, it wouldn't, but for, right? It wouldn't exist if the project didn't exist. And you can actually do some financing, which we'll talk about in just a minute, based on the revenues generated by the project. It's not city money either. It's project money, okay? Okay, so moving to the next level here. So project financing options, I just kind of touched on this, okay? So there are kind of three options, if you will, for financing a project. The first one is the least financially risky for the city. It's always the one I'm going to push you to, right? We like low financial risk for the city and its citizens because we're stewards of public funds, right? So what is pay-as-you-go? Pay-as-you-go is a project where the developer upfronts all of the costs, okay? And what will happen is they will typically get some sort of a bridge loan. They'll have some combination of their own equity, but they'll also have private financing to pay for the costs of the project up front. But once it's up and running and it starts creating the revenues, right, then they typically will flip their financing from a bridge loan or a construction loan into something that's longer term, okay? But the money that they upfronted or they even got loaned on, then as the money comes into the special allocation fund, it goes to pay them. That's pay as you go. If the project fails, it falls on its face, city walks away and says, that was your risk, developer. And, and in most cases anymore, that's exactly how it goes, okay? There is the next level of financial risk. It's not even really financial risk to the city, it's more reputational risk, is what we call TIF revenue bonds, okay? And so when you take a look at the possible financing of a TIF revenue bond, instead of the developer investing their equity, all of it, and all of their private loans to get the project out of the ground, get it built, right? Instead, we have this project, it's based on projections, and you go to market to bond investors who would buy bonds in the project, and you do, like we're familiar with this, right, at the city level, because sometimes we do general obligation bonds to upfront, a major, capital improvement project or something like that, right? And you say, here's the project, we're gonna, get a tax passed on this, it'll pay off in a certain amount of years, whatever. On a TIF revenue bond, what ends up happening is you work with a bond underwriter and a bond attorney in that case, and you take a bond to market to say, here's the project, right? And what usually happens in that circumstance is we have what we call a debt service coverage ratio. So if they need $10 million to get the public side of the project done, they need to issue bonds for $10 million. Then they'll need to show that they might need to show that that the project itself will produce enough revenue to pay the debt service for $15 million. And that's a 1.5 debt service coverage ratio, right? So, you don't typically, if they can just barely scratch through and they can just barely make their financing, nobody will buy bonds on that, right? So, but if the TIF revenue bond fails, the bondholders lose out. That was their risk, that was their investment. The developer doesn't have skin in the game in the way that they would with the pay-as-you-go, right? So the developer kind of gets out of it, and that's why I say it's reputational risk to the city, okay? I've had cities who had done TIF projects in the past that ultimately the developer failed and the project failed and the investors didn't get paid. The city didn't have to come out of the pocket to pay for it. You know, the worst case scenario is kind of like you know, if you have one, it happens sometimes. You know, it's not great, nobody loves it, but you know, the city wasn't at fault, it didn't fail the project. But if you keep passing projects that ultimately have bad debt on them, then people will start to go, and that's where the reputational risk comes in, okay? Now, the third kind is my third rail. Don't do it, okay? Don't do it. But I will tell you that there was a time, even in my career, prior to 2009, that cities on a very regular basis would do credit-enhanced bonds, okay, or TIF. These are TIF revenue bonds with a city credit enhancement or city backing, okay? So prior to 2009, it was extremely common. Everybody kind of wink and a nod knew that if the city said it would, you know, what it means is that if the developer's project fell short, you know, they needed to come up with $10 million for debt service and they could only come up with 9.5, that meant the city had to make up $500,000 of the debt service out of its general fund. Okay, so that's a city-backed bond. It was always a wink and a nod because what do cities, you know, what do we always talk about, right? There's always in your contracts that go out for more than a year when you have to pay money, we have an annual appropriation pledge in it, right? And what that means is under the law in Missouri, constitutional and statutory law in Missouri, you are not authorized as a board of aldermen to sign a contract that requires you to pay money out longer than a year unless you have the opportunity to make a decision every year at budget time to appropriate funds, okay? And so when cities were doing credit enhanced bonds back in the day all the time, what everybody knew is that it's a moral obligation to pay that credit enhancement, but not a legal one. And that's because as long as you hadn't appropriated funds for that year, you didn't owe anything, or you would only be responsible as a city to back the credit on the bonds up into what you had appropriated, but after that. So what happened in 2009? And I don't remember the exact year of the project I'm going to talk about, so it might have been right around the same time. But I will tell you in 2009, there was an economic downturn, and we saw the health of these types of projects faltered quite a bit. I was, you know, pretty new. I think I had started as an attorney in 2003, so I was about 6 years into it at this point. It was the first time we saw real challenges for cities and for deal financing. The other thing I will tell you is that roughly around that same time, there was a project that's kind of infamous in Missouri called the MAMTech project. And unfortunately, the city of Moberly, Missouri, got kind of sucked into a project where the state was really excited about, you know, doing contracts with China. And they had this guy come in and he was all hot because he had all these contracts to make sucralose, fake sugar. And they were gonna build a plant in Moberly, and boy, if they didn't do it in Moberly, they're gonna do it in 6 other places, and you better act quick. And you know, they landed in April and started talking to these people, and the city of Moberly issued $39 million worth of bonds for a fake sugar plant. And when I said that, I meant fake sugar, right? So, but there's a punchline, right? So they issued the bonds, and unfortunately, it turned out that the developer was a fraud, and he used some of the proceeds of the bonds to pay off his mansion in Beverly Hills. You know, he cooled his heels in Eldon, Missouri, I think it is, where the prison is, for some period of time. But he was a fraud. But the city was faced with the fact that they had credit enhanced $39 million worth of bonds. And when the bondholder said, time for our debt service payment, and the city said, there's no plant, sorry, you know, they were faced, their city council at that time was faced with a decision. Do we bankrupt the city, or do we tell the bondholders too bad? It was only a moral obligation. It's a tough decision. I never want you in that position. I think they made the right decision. They decided to stiff the bondholders, okay? Now, I will tell you for about 4 or 5 or 7 years after that, you couldn't finance a pothole to be filled in the city of Moberly. It wrecked their credit, okay? Their bond rating went to trash, literally. But they did the right thing because Moberly still exists today and they've kind of come back from it and so forth, okay? So I spent a lot of time talking about that. It's crazy important. Never do a credit-enhanced bond. You sometimes will have folks that will still try to talk you into it. Don't ever fall for it. I will punch you myself if you do it. So anyway, I wanted to make sure that you got the gravity of that story, so. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about how payments in lieu of taxes work. Okay, so from the ground up, okay, P, payments in lieu of taxes. What kind of tax are we talking about?
Property.
Yes. All right, here we go. So when you have a piece of property, and we're gonna use these crazy simple numbers, right? So look at your, the bigger gray box here. So we have property that we're talking about that is valued all the way at $1,000. Okay, put as many zeros behind it as you feel, makes it worth it to you, but let's use 1,000, okay? And we know that the tax rate is a levy of $5 per every $100 of assessed valuation, right? We remember these numbers when we set the bond levies every fall, right? So in this case, it's $5 of $100 of assessed valuation. So if you have $1,000 of property, that makes your total tax revenue for that project $50, right? Again, put as many zeros behind it as you need to. So when there's no TIF and you've got a piece of property and it's worth $1,000 and your assessed value your tax rate is $5 per $100 of assessed valuation, you're getting $50, okay? Then you put a TIF in place, okay? And so the TIF goes in and you start collecting revenues based on that TIF. Guess how much money you get after the TIF is in place? The same $50. You do not take a backward slide, right? All of the revenues you were making in the year before the TIF, whatever revenues that was, all of the taxing jurisdictions will continue making that, right? So if that number was 50,000 or 500,000 or 5 million, if that's what revenues were being passed through to the taxing jurisdiction at that time, even with a TIF in place, they're gonna keep getting that same number. They don't lose revenue, okay? But, whoops, wrong way. Then you do the TIF, right? So the whole point of the TIF is we're redeveloping a piece of property, we're making it more valuable. So we took that $1,000 piece of property valued at $1,000 and we turned it into a $100,000 valued property. The tax rate is still $5 per 100 of assessed valuation. It did not increase. Your taxes did not increase. The rate stayed the same. It always does, right? With the fluctuations annually when you set those, right? So now, when you take a look at the revenue that would be created, it creates now $5,000 instead of $50 in revenues, right? Now, what was our base revenue? The 50. So what's the incremental increase in tax revenues on pilots? It's $49.50, right? So of the $5,000 that's now being created because you have this developed piece of property that's no longer blighted and it's been improved, right? $44,950 is passing through to the special allocation fund that can reimburse the developer for doing the things that made it a $100,000 property instead of a $1,000 property. The $50 that was going through to the taxing jurisdiction, could be school district, they have a lot of property tax, that's where they make their revenues. They're still getting the same amount that they were, okay? So what I'm saying is, when TIF captures the incremental increase, TIF, tax increment financing, when it captures the incremental increase in property tax revenues, the base passes through, right? but TIF captures 100% of the new revenues being produced. None of the old, just the new. So that amount remains constant throughout the entire TIF, and then the valuation of the property, we hope that it keeps going up. That changes throughout until the TIF is over. Now we're going to shift to the other side. That was property tax. Now we're going to talk about economic activity taxes, sales tax revenues, right? It's calculated a completely different way. Under the TIF statute, you take a look at how much economic activity tax is being produced after the development is done, right? How much is that cash register ringing, okay? Now, before the greenfields limitations that we saw, a lot of TIFs got done in greenfields, which is why the General Assembly kind of tweaked it, right? So how much sales tax revenue is being produced on a green field or an infill lot in Branson where it's abandoned? How much is being produced? Zero, right? Okay. So you take a look at how much is being created after the development is done, and you subtract out of it the base, right? Sound familiar? That's what we do with property taxes too. But if the base is zero, the new increment is whatever the number that your sales taxes are now being produced, and that, so that's your increment. Under the TIF statute, 50% of the new revenue is captured and goes into the special allocation fund and can be used to pay back the developer. The other 50% goes to the taxing jurisdictions, okay? City would be one, right? So for every dollar of new sales tax revenues you can produce with a TIF, the city's gonna get 50 cents of that, and the developer's gonna get the other 50. Most projects that I work on, retail-oriented projects, the EATS side outpaces the pilot's side by 300%. These are typically used as retail development incentives, and this is where you can usually rely almost completely on the EATS and play with the pilots on the other side. Okay, so everybody get those concepts? Does that make sense? Because that is the bare knuckles. That's the basics of TIF right there. Okay.
Joe, it can be more than 50%, right?
Yes, that is a perfect segue. His question, if you didn't hear it, his question was, it can be more than 50%. It can be, right? So what we just talked about is, what does the statute say? Okay, so, wait, let's see. Yeah, I'm gonna cover this right now then. Okay, so what you can do, I might be stealing my own thunder for a slide later, so if that happens, we'll just bump through it. But it's a great question, let's get at it. Okay, so the statute says how you as a board of aldermen can do TIF, right? And you can't do more than that, right? But you can change it up a little bit within the parameters of the law. How do you do that? A redevelopment agreement, okay? A TIF redevelopment contract, a TIF agreement, okay? So on the TIF agreement, what we do, and this is why we talked about preliminary funding agreement last night, okay? Preliminary funding agreement says, developer, you're asking for $20 million in TIF revenues from us. The city's gonna hire its own consultants, legal, financial, bond counsel, whatever we need, depending on the ask. We're gonna hire our own, and developer, you're gonna pay for that. You're gonna give us a deposit, we're gonna pay our consultants out of that, and if it all gets approved, you can add that to one of your list of items to get reimbursed for, okay? And so, one of the things that your financial advisor will do is they will take a look at the numbers and they will compare those to the data that they have and what kind of return might a developer need on this, and so I'm gonna just throw some numbers out that maybe used to be accurate, probably aren't anymore, I don't even know, but what I will tell you is that if a developer would do a normal retail project for an 18% return, okay? The but-for analysis kind of would come in and say, it would take a look at what return would a developer make on this project if they had no incentives at all, right? Let's say that number comes back at 7%. If you were a developer and you know that the going rate out there is everybody's making at least 18%, would you do the deal at 7? No, you won't. I mean, it doesn't, it's not enough reward for the risk, right? So that would tell us that without incentives, a developer probably wouldn't take it on, okay? Then the next question is, based on the incentives that they're asking for, what kind of a return might they get? Well, what if it comes back and it says it's 23% with the incentives that they're asking for? Well, we know, you know, because you've asked a financial advisor to take a look at it, right? And they're gonna run some numbers, and they'll say, well, most developers would do this at 18. If you give them all the incentives that they ask for, they're gonna make 23. What should we do? We should probably tell them, we're not gonna let you use, you're not gonna let you use all of the incentives that you asked for, right? Now, and I'm getting to your question, I promise. When you're doing a policy, right, one of the questions you might wanna ask yourself is 23 worth it if it gets us the top thing on our list? It might be one time, right? But if you don't know what the top thing on your list is, how do you know whether to go to 23, okay? Or 22, or 20, okay? But if 18 is the number, what we would probably do is ratchet it back. Okay, so now I'm getting to your answer, okay? With a redevelopment agreement, if we need to get back to 18, what we can do is we can say that, that even though the TIF Act allows the developer to capture 50% of the sales tax revenues, we can require them to make a payment. This is also a payment in lieu in taxes, but let's not confuse it with the property tax one, right? But you can require them to make a payment back to the city to reduce down the amount of revenue that they would get. So it ends up being something less than the 50. We're allowed to do that under the law. We just can't necessarily give them more than the 50, and I'll talk about a caveat to that in just a second, right? Now, what I told you a few minutes ago is on the east side of things, right? On the sales tax side of it, it is a driver in most of these TIF projects. Sometimes it's 3 times the revenue we're dealing with on the property tax side, right? And again, we live in the world of sales tax as a city, right? And we know that some of our other taxing jurisdictions out there live in a world of property tax. But you guys get to say, when it's all said and done, whether the project is approved or not. I said it last night, and we'll cover it again in a minute. The school district gets a seat at the table at the recommendation part of a TIF, but in the end, you guys make the decision, and the other taxing jurisdictions have to live with it. So many times, if the project's too rich, one of the first places we will look is the pilots, the property tax side, and say, guys, you're asking, on your $15 million ask, it's 10 million, it's 12 million of sales tax, but the remainder is property tax, and you really don't need all of that. We could shave a couple, 2-3 million off. Why don't we look at you guys paying a payment in lieu of taxes on the property tax side? That money goes straight to the property taxing jurisdictions on a pro rata basis, right? So everybody's treated equally, but then they don't take as big a hit because they're being forced to get 100% of the new revenues captured to go to the developer otherwise. So we can put a term in the contract that will allow that then to be reduced down. And I think that answers your question. Sorry, there's a lot to it.
Because then that would benefit the school district as opposed to affecting them?
That is one way that we can be a good partner with our school district, our neighboring taxing jurisdiction in that way to say, we're going to, and some cities will put straight in their policy that they will require a TIF. Like they may never allow a 100% capture. They're going to always require at least a 25% pilot payment so that the school district doesn't get dinged as bad. I say the school district, but they're always the highest property tax, right? And again, when you talk about your policy, right, how big you make the flow of incentives or how small you make the flow of incentives should absolutely be determined by whether it's at the top of your list or not. That's why yesterday was so important. That's why I need you out talking to your constituents. It's why you've got to get to the heart of what it is that this city needs to be viable and relevant 50 years from now, 112 years from now, right? Double our age, right? Because that, and there was a question last night, like, how do you decide what's important or what's not. Well, by gosh, we decide because we know what it is that we need. Whether that is infill development, whether that is, year-round jobs, whether that's industrial versus, retail or whatever, that's what you guys have got to get to between now and the 29th, okay? And I'm not saying the 29th is a drop dead, right? This should always be a living, breathing document for you when it's said and done. Like, your work is never done. You're handing that baton to the next set of elected officials in 4 years, in 2 years, in 12 years, when your time is up, you will hand this off to somebody else. It was handed to you by people for 112 years, okay? It's your time right now. What are you gonna do with it?
Joe, a quick question.
Yeah.
The preliminary funding agreement is an important part of this. Can you kind of highlight what's normal and customary as the city is developing, a modernization of the economic development policy of what provisions should be included, what are the thresholds?
Yeah.
What's normal and customary for other types of communities and why that's so important?
Yeah, I'm gonna speak in terms of a major project kind of first, because everything else after that, you kind of whittle it back depending on the type of project, right? Because we're talking about, there may be some opportunities here for you, and you should be considering a more micro level approach as well with individual businesses, existing businesses, and so forth. But on a major project, right? Like some of the projects Branson has seen in the past, whether it's the aquarium or, the landing, or, you name whatever other projects we've done major incentives on. Today, in today's terms, what a preliminary funding agreement typically includes is the developer has to make at least a $20,000 or a $25,000 down payment to the city right up front that the city can engage its consultants and get to work on it, all right? And usually what the funding agreement will say is, we're not gonna start work as a city on this until you've committed that you're in it, okay? Now, for some weaker projects, weaker developers, that might wash them out. And I'm not gonna tell you that that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, again, we're talking big projects, we're not talking small ones. You can scale that for the size of project. The other thing that a preliminary funding agreement should require is an evergreen clause on that 20,000, okay, or 25, or whatever number you arrive at, right? So once you get the first bill from your consultants for doing work on the project, you pay it out of the fund that you've set aside, and it's all set up in the agreement. You pay it, and then you take those invoices from your consultants and you hand it to the developer and you say, replenish this account, okay? Now, the truth told, the expenses on that might run, $50,000, $60,000, $75,000 when it's all said and done. If the project is successful, that can be added as one of the line items that the developer, gets reimbursed for when it's all said and done, okay? But in the end, you then have the benefit of having your own consultants, qualified consultants in your court, helping you get the information you need to make the decisions, okay? Another thing I will note is that that funding agreement should absolutely require the developer to have their own counsel, okay? I've done deals with extremely sophisticated counsel on the other side, and I've done deals where there's no counsel on the other side. I will flat tell you, it will take 3 times as long to process the project if they don't have competent counsel on the other side. Because you're trying to explain stuff to people who don't understand what they're even asking for. It's frustrating. And it actually makes your project worse when it comes forward, because you don't have kind of sometimes you need that kind of butting of heads and the arguing and the negotiating to make the deal the best that it can be, right? But if they don't have good, competent counsel on the other side, you're gonna struggle, flat out. I'll just tell you, it's so frustrating. Okay? Is that what you were looking for?
Yeah,
That-
thank
that
you,
what you
Joe.
meant? Yeah.
And I thought it was also interesting with the preliminary funding agreement of having the applicant or the developer invest their earnest money up front.
Yes.
Which really, the city, of course, and the taxpayers having to shoulder that burden of vetting a project. I think it makes total sense when we look at our economic development policy, and this is an item for the board to consider of, saving taxpayer dollars, protecting taxpayer dollars into projects that might not come to fruition or pass the but-for test?
I gave the somewhat ludicrous but absolutely real example last night of, sitting down with my client and having this, elaborate project laid out. And then at the end, the applicant's ask was for the city to build it so they could manage it. And I mean, it sounds far-fetched. It's real, right? Now, the worst one is when they come in and they say, we want to do it, but they really don't know what they're doing. And, you get into a project and you find it out and it's too late. Like that's why, you don't want to spend as a city, $20,000, $30,000 on consultants to help you get your stuff straight when they didn't have their stuff straight to begin with. And your citizens should pay for that when they don't know what they're doing? Heck no. Heck no. The developer can pay for that. To some extent, the development will pay for it if it's all successful, and it's just part of the cost of doing a project like this, okay?
Thank you, Joe.
All right, thank you. Okay, so a couple quick notes here on TIF. Redevelopment projects have to be completed, and any bonds, if issued, have to be paid for the cost within 23 years after the TIF project ordinance is adopted. So these are some timelines to think about. 23 years is the length of time that an individual project can be open. Remember, I talked about plan, redevelopment area, redevelopment projects. Okay, the next slide is the one where we talk about that. All redevelopment project ordinances must be adopted within 10 years after a TIF plan is adopted, okay? So you can adopt a plan, remember, and I said, you can do speculative TIF, right? You can say, we have a project that we want developers to do. We can create the plan, and the TIF Act gives you up to 10 years to find a developer to do it, if you do it that way, okay? But from the adoption of a plan, the first project doesn't even have to start for 10 years. And then remember, each project, the bullet point above, each project can last 23 years. Just as a note, you can use eminent domain with TIF in Missouri. You have to exercise it within 5 years after the TIF project ordinance is adopted. And then my final bullet point there is greenfield area TIFs are prohibited. That's a bit strong. Most developers attorneys right now are treating it as though that's what the statute says is they're prohibited. They're not completely prohibited, but they're highly limited that you cannot do a TIF in a greenfield area, which is defined essentially by, a piece of property that has around it, agriculturally used, predominantly agriculturally used land, okay? It doesn't even have to be in the city, but it has to be, and it doesn't have to be zoned ag, it just has to be used ag. If that land has been in the city for less than, I think it's 10 years. So. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about the difference between a plan, well, actually an area and projects, okay? So when you have a redevelopment plan, it talks about how it's gonna redevelop a redevelopment area, and it can be done in projects. I did a project for the city of Grandview, Missouri, where we saved their old Truman Shopping Center. It was on the old Harry Truman farm, had been around since the 50s. It had gone completely defunct really by the mid-2000s. And we breathed a bunch of life back into that. The first developer that came along took the area where the shopping center was laid out and had 13 redevelopment project areas in there. I was like, whew, that's a lot. We ultimately got it down to something less through the negotiation process, but you can have, that many. I'm gonna show you a very simple project with 4 redevelopment project areas. So, my years are getting old on my presentation here, but so in a redevelopment project area that is existing because you adopted a plan, right? You have up to 10 years to do the first redevelopment project. But let's just say redevelopment project area 1 starts TIF in 2015 in that circumstance. That TIF could run until 2038, okay? You can have a second redevelopment project area, a separate phase of the same redevelopment area, the same plan, but a new project. And let's say that one starts the TIF in 2016. And this is very realistic, right? Because, it's gonna take time to, do the site work on the project area, and then to, build the foundation and bring the vertical construction up out of the ground and get the stores stocked or whatever you're doing, right? So it makes sense to phase. In my example, then, you jump forward 4 years, and at 2020, you could start Project Area 3, and that TIF project can run and collect TIF until 2043. And then on the outside of my TIF, which must have been adopted in 2014, you could start it all the way in 2024. I must have done this like 10 years ago, maybe, like this first slide. So you could start that redevelopment project area in 2024. And if you start a TIF redevelopment project this year, it can actually collect TIF until 2047, right? And when I say collect TIF, what am I talking about? Remember the boxes and the incremental increase in the buckets? Okay, that's what we're talking about, that portion, the collection of TIF. Okay, so if the TIF plan is adopted in 2014, you have 10 years, that's my 2024 in this example, and then once the 10 years once you've triggered the TIF, you have 23 years. So truthfully, you could have a plan that is adopted in 2024, right? And it doesn't even start collecting TIF until 2034, okay? And then you have an additional 23 years on top of that. But that's all how TIF works, okay? Okay, typical TIF plan process and timeline. Developer submits a plan, we take a look at it, staff review, we do always, remember what I said about the TIF Act. It's designed for cities to set it up, but most of the time a developer comes in. Regardless of whether a developer brings it to you or you do it yourself, you still have to send out requests for proposals to do the project. Kind of a weird thing, but you do. So the developer has to respond to an RFP to do their own project that they brought to you. And I have had it before where other developers actually submitted on someone else's proposal. That project I was telling you about in Grandview where we redid the shopping center, I ended up with 3 developers who were vying for it. It was insane. I've never seen it, before that, I've never seen it since. But we did have it in that circumstance. Once you put a notice out for a TIF commission hearing, you have to wait 45 days before the TIF commission hearing can be held, okay? So I mentioned last night the leverage and, like the city gets what it wants when your leverage is highest at the early part of the project. As soon as you do the procedural steps and you start going down the line, you start to lose leverage right away. So when a developer comes in and they want incentives, they're gonna be, how soon can you get that 45-day notice letter out? How fast can you do it? And we're like, as soon as we have the deal, lined out, tacked out the way, we think is in the best interest of the city, we'll do that, okay? And so, because your leverage drops, because as soon as they get you on that thing, then all of a sudden, oh, it took us 3 weeks to get you this information now, sorry. And now, you've lost 15 of your 45 days and they start to put you in a pinch. And so that's just something that we do, from the city side to say, we're gonna keep this in front of us. We're gonna make sure that we have the ultimate amount of time to review projects to make sure that they're good and they're gonna be a good use of taxpayer dollars, okay? There's a TIF commission public hearing. Once the public hearing closes, the TIF commission votes whether to recommend approval or denial. And regardless of that answer, you have to wait 14 days before it can come to the Board of Aldermen. And then, at the Board of Aldermen, you can then decide whether to approve or deny. And I've had situations where the TIF commission recommended disapproval, denial, and the council, the Board of Aldermen, did approve it. So there's just a different vote requirement in that circumstance. And then typically, either sometimes we'll have the TIF contract ready to go so that if the plan is approved, that there's a contract ready to be decided that night. Sometimes you have to negotiate it later. Sometimes if it's a really close call, whether it's a good project and it's gonna be, something that you're gonna have to really work with the board about, we might wait on the TIF contract and not spend the money, because if you guys end up killing it anyway, there's no sense in negotiating the contract. So we always have that term sheet though up front. Okay, let's talk about TIF commissions. So TIF commissions, they're made up of 11 commissioners, and these can be different throughout the state depending on where you're located, what county you're in, and so forth. But for you all, you have 11 commissioners. And the way it works is 6 commissioners are appointed by the city. Most cities, and I should have looked this up before I got here tonight, but I don't remember off the top of my head for you guys. Most cities, and I always advise this, their 6 TIF commissioners serve for a term of years, okay? And it's staggered terms like you're used to. And so they're on, and they're always there, and they're rolling off, or you're reappointing and you're doing whatever. They're live, okay? Then the other 5 members, the city has the choice in the statute whether to have them also serve for a term of years or whether they serve just for the time that a plan is being approved or being considered, right? I recommend that you only do it for the time, right? And here's an example of why. Depending on where you are and what part of your county, you could have different taxing jurisdictions involved, right? When I did that project for the city of Grandview, Grandview happens to be split. The northern half is covered by the Hickman Mills School District. The southern half is covered by the Grandview School District. And I'll be darned if that dang shopping center didn't have like 50 feet at the bottom that was in the Grandview School District. So in that circumstance, we actually had to go meet with the superintendents and say, hey, y'all, there's this giant project that's happening. It's like 97% in the Hickman Mills School District, but it is somewhat in Grandview. So we need you guys to decide amongst yourselves whether you're going to have, who's going to represent. And luckily, the Grandview people looked at that and went, this is your baby. It's going to affect you guys more. And they let Hickman Mills have both members of the school district. But I've had other projects that were more evenly split, and they did a 1-and-1, or, I've seen it also where Hickman Mills said, Grandview, you can do it. So, and, that's just an example, but you could have all kinds of different, library districts or, weed districts or whatever, not the marijuana stuff, the other, that you could change. And so my recommendation is, do it for every time that the plan is up. Plus it's 5 less people you got to keep track of, make sure they haven't died, moved out of the, the country or the county or wherever, and make sure that they're in there. And so what happens, the statute says, is if they just serve for the time that a plan is pending, you send them a notice to say, hey, we got one, heads up, we're going to be having a thing, let us know who your people are going to be and be here. And what the statute says is you can send it to the taxing jurisdictions, you send them the notice, and if they can't figure it out amongst themselves, you can proceed without them too. So they usually are pretty good about getting it figured out. Advantages of TIF. So what are some advantages of TIF? You can use TIF bonds to provide the municipality and the redeveloper with some available funds at the beginning of the project. Just don't credit enhance them. So you do have some ability to do revenue bonds. Pay-as-you-go is always the best. It's the least financially risky for the city. TIF does not rely solely on property tax relief. The difference, we'll learn in a minute, in a little bit, between 353 corporations, which were the original blight remediation tool, is they only have property tax as a source. TIF improved upon that because it created that economic activity tax piece, which ends up being the bigger driver. And so that's why TIF ended up being a really good tool until people just started using it poorly and the General Assembly wrecked it. But, made it better. TIF does provide for direct representation of all affected taxing jurisdictions on the commission. It is at a recommending place, but they have that. Other types of tools, all they get to do is come and comment before you, but they have no say. At least with a TIF commission, they have the ability to make recommendations. And then you can use eminent domain if you need it to assemble property. And I've been in situations where you had one holdout. The project was a really great one. Everybody in the community knew it, but, old Mrs. Johnson, she had raised her family there and, she wasn't going to give it up. And, it's one of those things, heart-wrenching, but. Okay, that's TIF. CID.
Joe, can I ask a question real quick?
Yes.
Cody, me.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Before you
What's a
move on.
cubit? That's an old joke.
Before you move on away from TIF, I'm intrigued by the speculative TIF idea you mentioned earlier. Is there any downside if a city says, okay, well, let's take this defined area in the hopes that there will be some development there? Is there any downside to a city saying, we're going to put this TIF there and, you have 10 years, obviously, to get something going, but if it doesn't, is there any downside to a city for that?
The only downside is, when when you have a developer coming to you to make an application for incentives, you can use that preliminary funding agreement. You can make them make that initial deposit. You know, they're paying on their nickel to get the plan, you know, developed, approved, and so forth, okay? When you decide to do a speculative TIF, that's on you. You know, the city is investing in that circumstance in a project, and there's no guarantee that a developer will submit an a proposal to your request. So you would have the cost of going through, creating a plan, running the TIF commission through it, you know, going through all of the notices and doing all of the work, not knowing for sure that you'll ever have a buyer on the other end of it. But you have up to 10 years to find somebody, you know, and some cities have looked at it and said, you know, we think we can get it there, but, you know, like in you know, my example of Pleasant Valley, you know, at the time, developers weren't kicking their tires. They weren't even going to spend the money to get a TIF plan in place. So when the city made the investment and got their own plan in place, then it kind of showed, you know, the developers that, yes, there's a plan here. And it actually, I mean, we used, you know, real numbers the best that we could, and we came up with something, and the developer looked at it and went, okay, I can live with this, and I might, you know, go in and ask for a bit of an amendment, but they don't have to go through the process that the city went through in order to get it done. And so there was a real upside to it. But, you know, that was an investment that the city made, and luckily for them, it panned out.
Well, and I'm just thinking there's particularly in Branson, right? I mean, we have certain areas that are kind of unique to Branson. I think this was brought up last night. So you've got, you know, a portion of 76, which is, you know, an integral part of our city, obviously, that's not in the CID. There's not a lot of economic activity going on in a certain portion of it. There's not been a whole lot of new development, things like that. So when you have that sort of unique asset, does that speculative TIF make more sense in that situation versus, hey, there's just this, you know, piece of property over here and we're going to put a TIF on it?
Yep. So a couple things to keep in mind would be, you know, number one, if that is your priority, right? If, you know, that's your one or your two or your three or whatever, then and this is, again, it's why I want to come back to what are your goals, right? But if your goal is to take a look at that, you know, kind of, we're talking about the gateway to the city right there, right? You know, when you get off at 76 off of 65. So if that's an area, that is a tool that you guys could utilize to say, we're going to do a TIF plan, and then we're going to put, you know, requests for proposals out there to get that done. Now, that can work. You could have, you could do a TIF. You could, you know, find a way to make that beautified, right? Now, keep in mind, though, that the TIF that opens, you know, there's going to be pass-through revenue. I don't remember off the top of my head what segment that might be and whether that segment is actually in the TIF and whether they're producing any CID sales tax revenues. But let's, for the sake of argument, let's say they are, then that revenue would be captured. You know, the new revenue would be captured to the TIF and wouldn't flow to the CID, okay? But if it's not, then that would be, you know, then arguably, you know, there'd be a way that, well, either way, I mean, there would be no base revenue if it's not being captured. So all of it would, all of the full 50% would be going to the developer if there are no CID dollars, and if they put a CID sales tax in, then 50% of it would be captured by the TIF after that.
So that's really a good question to ask. The eastern portion of 76, right? We all talk about it for years. The west 2/3, 3/4 of 76 has a CID generating revenue. We have a $100 million plan in place. But that gateway to Branson is, I could almost say, blighted. But that is a real...
Blight's not a dirty word, by the way, in economic development terms.
Yeah, I meant to
You
say-
need it because, I think it's a great point to make, though. It's not, you don't have to go blight. You know, like you can say blight and be proud of it, because without blight, you don't have, that blight is one of the best public benefit reasons out there, right? Remediating blight.
It's
So,
less appealing.
yeah. I get that, but people, that's another one of those common misconceptions, especially in the economic development world, is blight is good. Blight will actually increase the value of your property, right? Because you can get incentives to fix blight. If you're not blighted, too bad, then it's not that bad.
I think that is really something.
Well, and I mean, I know we have some of the 76 CID board members in here, but I seem to recall a presentation a year or two ago, and from basically Fritz's east to 65 is not in that district. Okay, so I'm getting confirmation of that it's not.
Yeah.
Okay, so getting confirmation of that, and so when you mentioned the speculative TIF without a clear plan or a developer coming and asking for us, that just seems like an area that we've all said is the gateway to our city. And it was mentioned last night, we've all mentioned it, when you get off 65 and you start heading in, that's the first thing you see, and so there's an opportunity there. And that's just one of those unique parts of our city that I would argue is different from a lot of other places. They don't have that unique stretch of road that you're driving through that really defines and
Right.
is particular to your city.
Yeah, this is a great concept. Again, this is something that, could come out of your goals, when you set a policy, right? That that you could utilize. But don't tool fixate, right? Get your goals first. But if that's a goal, this is a way that you could, as a city, you could move forward on that and show, hey, this is something that we're willing to do here. Now, I will say, because we had to have that little talk about blight, as property owners along there, if you go in there and say, okay, we're coming in and we're forcing this on you and we're going to do this plan and we're going to do a blight study and we're going to declare you blighted, you better have a really good educational program in place so that people understand the benefit of being blighted. Because, people go berserk and they're like, you're going to devalue my property and it's like, your property is what it is. If we can declare it blighted, we can actually give you more money to fix stuff. And whether you sell that interest and a developer, gets the benefit of that or whatever, that's going to increase your value. But man, people, they don't hear the words when you tell them that.
Did you mention earlier a ballpark, what that TIF plan fee would be for the city, or does it change with whatever the
It varies on the
value?
complication, like if we're simply reviewing what another developer, another attorney, especially our competent attorney, like I have deals, where there's a development attorney in Kansas City and that guy ends up on, I bet he's been on 24 other projects that I've been on, and it's like, I know what he's gonna do, we just know each other so well. It's just kind of like, remember the old, when, the sheepdog was, passing, on the Wile E. Coyotes and like, morning Sam, morning Bill, it was like, that's how it kind of was, So, but if the city is doing it all themselves, like we don't have that sounding board of the attorney on the other side, and you're gonna end up footing the entire bill of it. So it can be a little bit more. I mean, what is that number? It depends on the complexity. It could be, like, worst case scenario, it's probably 75,000, might be 60, might be 50.
And that's
could be
like
as low as 30, who knows?
And that's like a one-time deal for that full 10 years?
Yes. And again, that is a reimbursable project cost. So, I have done deals before, like there's a deal in Grain Valley, Missouri, right? They had a MoDOT matching project, and MoDOT came to them and said, y'all have a horrific F-rated interchange here, fatalities, everything. We're coming to you and we're telling you that we will do a $16 million improvement if you'll come up with $8 million. And the city was like, I don't have couch cushions big enough for that. Like, what are we gonna do? We started a speculative TIF there to come up with the $8 million for the exchange. While we were in the process, a developer approached them and said, I see what you're trying to do here, I'll do that corner. And so we let them then take the lead on it, So there are ways to get it done, so.
Yeah, so what you're, sometimes that'll spark a development. I mean, if they
Yes.
see that the city's serious enough to invest some hard dollars, that might spark them
Yep.
to do something they wouldn't.
And your cost then, I'm sorry, I forgot where I was going with that story. But in the end, the city did an $8 million project. They came up with the $8 million to match MoDOT, and we did a 4-corner TIF. The developer that did the first corner got their project done. We did not allow TIF to be done on any of the other 3. The city did the TIF, and the city got repaid its $8 million off of the other development, and boy, did it come. It blew up.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, Joe, could you have multiple people, as part of that TIF? And could the TIF be non-adjacent parcels?
Well, you're getting into the really complicated stuff. It is infinitely more difficult to do that. I'm going to leave it at that for right now. I've done deals where actually we had an area here and an area up here, and we actually ran it along the highway to get it up. I don't know that I've ever done like if you have a redevelopment area, you could do a project over here and a project over here and nothing in between, but it's all within the area. So you still have to draw your area, I think, contiguous, but I would actually have to go look up something on that one. And I can do most of this stuff in my sleep, but that one I can't.
So Joe, I know we have a lot of material to cover.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to really go fast, but this part has been really good. We don't, but if you're looking to take a break.
Yeah, first I wanted to compliment Cody. That is something that we have been communicating, right, a long time and scratching our head, not saying that this would be a silver bullet, but I think it sure is worth the time and effort to explore it, right?
I will promise you this, the other stuff is not near as complicated as TIF. TIF is a very interesting and unique, robust program. It has so many options. It gets such a dirty name in the legislature. It gets such a dirty name in the public. It is a great tool, and I hate that people kick the crap out of it all the time because it really can be used well. But unfortunately, there are jurisdictions in the state that have used it poorly, and this is what ends up happening is the people that would use it right don't get to use it as robustly. So.
Yeah.
Joe, is it your opinion, though, that, and I'm just throwing this out there because I think it's a brilliant idea, is it your opinion that a city could possibly be oversaturated with TIFs?
Yes. Absolutely. And I will tell you, as a part of your policy, and this really should have been more clearly stated last night when I did consideration, so I'm very thankful that you came back to that, right? I'm a firm believer that if you give incentives to everybody, you give incentives to nobody, okay? One of the considerations you should make when you're considering doing incentives for a project is, first, right, what am I gonna say? Did it achieve one of your goals, right? But if it achieved one of your goals and you've checked the box, then we don't need incentives for that anymore, okay? And the people that are willing to take the risk out front should be rewarded more than the people who waited, we're gonna see if other people were successful, and then they're like, well, then I wanna step in and I wanna ride those coattails. Where's the risk in that? And so, that my example of Grain Valley, the developer who stepped in and said, city, I see what you're trying to do here. I'm willing to do this. You know what? That developer failed. And we did have a second developer that came in and took it over and made it even better. But that developer was willing to take a risk where others weren't. And the city opened the floodgates and said, we're going to give you incentives. But you know what? When that project got done, they closed it because then development started coming. And it blew up. You probably don't ever get a chance because of where you are in Missouri, but if you're ever on I-70 heading eastbound out of Kansas City towards St. Louis, Grain Valley is right there. There's a B&B theater. There's a new, fantastic grocery store. That was all part of the incentivized piece of it, but now there's a giant Quick Trip and a Culver's and, there's a McDonald's and an Advanced Auto and the gas station that was this really terrible, nasty gas station has totally redone itself, and the whole quadrant of their interchange on I-70 has completely been redone, and the city only incentivized the northeast corner of it. The rest of it came.
What elements of a TIF, other than the developer just failing and run out of money or whatever, and you've done a lot of these, what elements of a TIF would make someone look back and go, oh man, that was bad? I mean, are there are there certain things that would make you look down the road and go, man, wish you had, you know what I mean?
A lot of these have kind of sorted themselves out over the years. Certainly if, back in the day when I first started doing this stuff, cities were backing bonds on everything, and I would never do that again. But that's just the rule now. Cities don't do it, and developers don't even ask anymore. But That would be one.
If you didn't do the credit enhancement ones and the certain ones, I guess you kind of said, well, you were talking about a downside of a different thing, but you understand what I'm asking? I mean, if you did a TIF, what could make it fail other than the developer itself?
I mean, so economic conditions could do it. I mean, if you're relying on a retail TIF and we have
So
a
just-
giant recession and people aren't spending money anymore, COVID could hit
Yeah.
and people don't travel to your city anymore, it's going to be, it's construction risk, it's weather risk, does a tornado hit it and it has to be rebuilt, so I mean, and these are real things that we deal with, right? So those are the types of things, but what do? We get business interruption insurance. We get natural disaster, earthquake insurance or whatever, we got the New Madrid fault not that far away. We insure against that stuff, right? When we're smart business people. Now, we're not gonna dictate that as a city, but, we might put in a contract that, if we're, giving you some of our revenue, then you better have a way to rebuild this thing if something happens to it, and we can put some insurance requirements that way. And we do that.
If you were an extremely small town, thinking about Clay's question, and you did a TIF, and you brought in a Walmart Supercenter, for example, and that was the only retail that you had in your city. I mean, I guess you could make the argument that you're losing a lot of the sales tax, but the sales tax that you're still going to get 50% of it, and that was zero at the first place, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, incentives can be a long game. I mean, for the most part, a developer, if they need the incentive, TIF is for a big project. I'm just gonna flat tell you, it is not worth the cost of forming one for a tiny little project. So we're talking tens of millions of dollars when we're talking TIF, okay? And that's why it's so complicated. If I have a small community that's looking to do something, I'll be honest with you, it's gonna be a sales tax reimbursement agreement. It might be a Chapter 100 project, it might be some combination of those types of things that you can utilize. But on the really big projects, TIF makes tremendous sense.
So what I'd like to do is, let's put this on the list of, when we look at our priorities, and I'm gonna suggest taking a 10-minute break and then get you to talk
I
faster.
promise I will go faster through the rest of it, but I mean, we covered a lot of ground because TIF scares up almost all of the stuff for the considerations in your policy, and so we've talked about that. I can hammer through the rest of
Yeah,
it.
it's a 4-letter word. Yeah,
What's that?
TIF.
No, it's only 3.
10-minute break.
It's only 3.
That's okay.
It won't be that, but we'll get through it. I still got to drive home.
I'd like to call this meeting back to order. Joe, keep on trucking.
Okay, thanks again for bearing with me. We do have a lot to cover yet, but I need to get it done myself because I'm heading back to myself tonight. So, like I said, it'll be, less complex as we go. So the next tool that we're going to talk about is community improvement districts. This is something that the city is actually very familiar with. You have a lot of great use of community improvement districts in the community already. This tool is located in Chapter 67 at 67-1401 to 67-1571, Missouri Revised Statutes. Again, insomnia or excitement, whichever it is, you can cure it right there. I'll talk with you just a little bit about a couple concepts, if you will, for CIDs. And there's the three that you see on the screen there, the secondary bullet points. So the first one I'm going to talk about is what I would call an on-paper CID, okay? And when I say an on-paper CID, what I would say is that is using a CID as a funding mechanism to enhance other economic development tools, especially TIF, okay? So let's explore that one for just a second, okay? So if you have a developer who comes to you and says, I've got this really great project and I need you to give me $10 million and I want to do it all through TIF, right? So we already just learned a few minutes ago that part of a big piece of TIF is economic activity taxes, which are what? Sales taxes, gold star for Clay. We it just makes me laugh. So they come in, they want the $10 million. They're going to do a use that creates sales taxes, right? And so what did we learn? It doesn't increase the tax rate, right? Whatever the taxes are in the area, it's a collection mechanism if we create more revenues. So if the city has a 1% sales tax that produces $500,000 a year in this particular TIF area, if we created a CID and it also imposed a 1% sales tax, how much revenue per year would that CID create? This is an easy one, y'all. It's the same 500,000, right? Because if the city has a 1% sales tax and the CID has a 1% sales tax, they're going to create the same amount of money, right? So you see where I'm going here? Yeah. If the CID doesn't exist, but it would create 500,000 or 5 million, I don't care, 100, a million, whatever. If the CID would create the same amount with a 1% sales tax as the city's 1% sales tax would, why would we not suggest that once we figure out that they need the 10 million, that we would say, oh, and by the way, developer, we would like you to form a CID and impose a 1% sales tax on your development because that will produce that revenue, and we can now reduce the amount that the other city, all us and the other taxing jurisdictions need to pay you by the amount that CID would create every year. It's a way that you can reduce down the ask by creating a new taxing jurisdiction. Now, technically, legally, that would increase the taxes in that area, right? Because there wasn't a CID before, there would be a CID now. So the sales tax for that particular business, that particular project or series of businesses or whatever would go up by the 1%. But it goes up by the 1% on something that never existed before. It's only created by the project, and it's used to pay the project back faster, and it reduces the amount that you and all of the other taxing jurisdictions pay. Let's use one on-paper CIDs, and let's encourage them, right? But let's not do this. Let's not have the developer look at it and go like, hey, I can get, $10 million if I do TIF and a CID and a TDD and do all that, together, because in the end, they're just expanding their ask, right? We focus them on the TIF, right? And then we ask them to add the on-paper to reduce down the city's burden and the other taxing jurisdictions' burden. That's smart use of economic development incentives right there, right? Okay, so I just wanted to explore that one. CIDs is actually a really soft spot in my heart. When I was just a little mere law student, wasn't even a baby attorney yet, I wrote an article that was published in the Journal of Missouri Bar on CIDs. It was even cited in a court case or two. I'm rolling. That's like a gold star for me, right? So, yeah, right. No billboards, sorry. You've got them all covered. You can use CIDs actually as an enhanced homeowners association. That was one of the points I was making in there is CIDs actually would be a great replacement for homeowners associations in communities. We've had, maybe you've had developments where the developer leaves and the homeowners association falls out of sorts and they can't collect the annual dues, and there's all these problems, and the pool turns into a mosquito pit, and it's all, they don't keep up their common areas. If you had a CID in place, you could actually, the CID could do all of the things. It can pay for common area maintenance. It can, pay for a pool. It can do all of those things. And the property owners could actually pay their annual dues in the form of a special assessment at the end of the year. It's paid to the county and it's taken care of that way. Not a lot of people know that, but that is a potential use for CIDs that's out there, and I've seen a few. There are also specific purpose entities designed to meet a specific need identified by district property owners. One of, I hear that it maybe has fallen a little bit out of favor, but I will say, still one of the most, I think, the coolest projects I got to work on was I was approached right about the time that the landing was being finished and was beginning to open for business by Gayla Roten with the Main Street program. And she reached out to me because the downtown business owners were concerned that the landing would cannibalize their businesses, that people would drive right past downtown, shop at the landing, and never stop again at Dick's Five and Dime or some of the other neat stores down here. And so I was asked to help the downtown people create a community improvement district, and we did that so that we could build a trolley that would drive throughout the streets of downtown. And we did it in a specific way so that the trolley was authorized to drive even through the parking lots of the landing. And if people were shopping at the landing, they could park there, they could put their bags in their trunk, they could jump on the trolley, and they could go up the hill. If their hips weren't working well, or they had other impediments to being able to walk long distances, they could get on a trolley and they could be dropped off at the front door of multiple different businesses throughout the district. And it was so wildly successful that we had to turn people away at the end because we were, in the process at that point. And, several years later, we came back and we doubled the size of that district and ran it all the way up almost to 65. But that was, a special use where people, at that time, the business owners in downtown Branson were so concerned about what the effect of the landing might, have on, whether it would cannibalize their businesses, that they came up with a way on their own to impose a 1% sales tax downtown to pay for a trolley that would move people around and keep downtown viable. I think that's a neat use of CID. These are always created by an ordinance of the city, so the Board of Aldermen approves CIDs, okay? You maintain control of those. They can pay for lots of stuff. CIDs are really fantastic tools, super broad powers. They can pay for, this is basically I copied and pasted out of the statute all of the types of improvements. You can kind of see these, downtown beautification projects and banner projects and signage and, all kinds of neat projects. These were built essentially, they're not technically, they weren't built for this, but man, do they work well with these historic downtown groups. I used to serve on the board of directors for the Missouri Main Street Connection for about 11 years. It's got a very special place in my heart, and we have used CIDs throughout communities to do economic development through historic renovations in communities all over the place, and CIDs are perfect for that. You can build all kinds of infrastructure and improvements, and you can provide crazy amounts of services. If you've ever been downtown Kansas City, you see the people in the black and yellow jackets. Those folks are ambassadors. They're paid for by the downtown CID. And so they are there, and it's paid for by the businesses who put a 1% sales tax in, and they go in and they keep the downtown clean. They give people, directions. Sometimes they'll help, some homeless people, find a place to stay, things like that. There's a picture of the trolley, that's a service that you can provide. You can even pay for community events and, festivals and things like that. They're just amazing tools. So I highly recommend the use of CIDs in many, many ways. They have multiple funding mechanisms. As I mentioned before, you can form them as a not-for-profit corporation or a political subdivision of the state. What's the benefit of the political subdivision? It has taxing authority. You can impose sales taxes and property taxes. If you're a CID, that is a governmental entity, a political subdivision CID. If it is a nonprofit CID, the only thing it can do is impose special assessments because they're not truly taxes, they're in the nature of a tax. They're essentially kind of like a fee that gets paid at the end of the year. Springfield and Liberty, they must have really good lobbyists because for some reason CIDs in those cities can do business licenses too, so who knows. User fees are also an option. When we originally put the trolleys together, there was a big question that we kind of wrestled with and went back and forth about whether we should charge a fare or not. And a fare to ride the trolley would have been a user fee, right? There's authority to do that, but the decision was made that, that these should be free so that people can widely utilize them. And so the sales tax was going to be enough to pay for it, and it has been. Moving from CIDs into the next acronym alphabet soup of TDDs, Transportation Development Districts, okay? These are also political subdivisions of the state. If you do a transportation development district, the city doesn't have near the control for formation. It's because if they do that, it actually has to be formed through a court order. So it's the weirdest dang thing you've ever seen. I always tell people, I'm a lawyer who hates to wear a suit, hates to go to court. My job is to keep you all out of court. So I feel like if you're in court, I mess something up. But this is one place where I actually do have to go and stand in front of a judge. And what ends up happening is when a transportation development district is being formed, whoever wants to form the district has to sue the city and MoDOT in order to get it formed in the county in which it is. And it's the friendliest lawsuit you ever see. The judge usually stands there and they're just like, what? And, we have to get in there and say, well, the statute says that they had to sue us and MoDOT over here, but we all are working together because we want these improvements to happen. So judge, just go along with us, please sign this order, form the TDD. And then it is formed as a political subdivision in that circumstance. So it's kind of like a little mini city within your city or wherever your taxing jurisdiction is that forms it. And so when it's formed, you can tell by its name, what it can do is pay for transportation improvements. So where I have seen it before, and if y'all are familiar with Lee's Summit at all, they have back in the late 90s, early 2000s, they built the Summit Woods Shopping Center. It was kind of the first really big shopping center for Lee's Summit. And they used TIF layered with CID, layered with TDD on that project to pay for everything. And part of it was they had tremendous transportation transportation needs, signalization, new roads, new lanes, all kinds of parking and stuff like that can all be paid for with a TDD. And so they had, whoa, oh, did you do that? You're speeding me up, I know. So you can pay for all these transportation improvements with that. CIDs can pay for transportation improvements too, plus all the services and the other stuff that we talked about. So these are much more limited. They also have a sales tax, a property tax, a special assessment, or a toll that can be utilized to create the revenues for that. That was TDs. I told you it would go faster. Neighborhood improvement districts is the next tool that we're going to talk about. Neighborhood improvement districts, these are the ones I told you about early on tonight, first slide, if you can still remember. These are not separate political subdivisions, even though NID, CID, or NID sounds a lot like some of the other stuff we've talked about. These are the ones where the city essentially designates an area that is going to receive public improvements, and the public improvements would essentially benefit really only that area, okay? And when that happens, the city will come up with the financing, and there'll be bonds that are actually issued to pay for it. And then the bonds are paid off because special assessments are then issued to the property owners who benefit in the area to repay that, okay? So here's some examples of how success has been had with some of these. Cass County, Missouri, which is just south of the Kansas City metro, or kind of the very southern rim of that, they had a lot of situations where out in the country, they would have all these country estate subdivisions. You know, you've seen them maybe before. We were out driving around, all of a sudden out of nowhere, there's like 15 houses on 5 acres each, and they have a gravel road out there and whatever. But, you know, what would happen is the developer would develop these 5-acre lots. They'd put in a gravel road. They would sell off the lots, and they would truck on to the next one. Well, you know, winter then would come, and there would be 15-foot drifts, and they're all private, you know, roads because the county's not going to do the gravel roads in that circumstance. And so the homeowners would be like, who's going to come out and plow our streets? I'm like, that's like a giant driveway. You're going to do it yourself, you know? And so people would be like, they didn't really understand that that could happen. And then the county's like, you know, we never accepted dedication of it. It's not a public road. If you want to make it a public road, what they ended up coming up with is, we'll split the cost, you know, for you to pave it and to bring it to spec so we can run our plows on it. And you pay 50% through a neighborhood improvement district, and we'll finance it out over 20 years. And that was a solution to a problem they were commonly having there. You know, I've had situations before, you know, when you sit down as a city, every year you look at your capital improvement budget, right? And you talk about, you know, Michael comes in with his big smile and he says, you know, we got to fix this and we got to fix this, and he's all excited about it, you know, and, you know, you go through and you prioritize what you need. And sometimes, sometimes citizens complain and they, you know, want to come and, be angry about the fact that, you know, they got potholes on their streets. And what they don't understand is that they're mad about their street, but they're sitting at number 15 on the list. So there's 14 other people above them that have it way worse, you know, and so my solution, I haven't had any citizens or cities take me up on this yet, is like, hey, if they want to bump up the list, offer to do a NID and tell them, you know, their neighborhood can be done next if they'll pay for half of it, and we'll bump them up the list, you know, because then you get the project taken care of at half the cost, and you move on. Everybody should be happy, right? Well, nobody wants to pay for their part of it. They just want it done faster. So, well, you know, your stuff's not as bad as the stuff here, and we got to fix that first, you know, because if we keep fixing your stuff down here, we never fix this, and that gets even worse, and cars fall into an abyss. Okay, so neighborhood improvement districts, they can be formed either with a property owner petition, or the city can can basically call an election to form an NID. Again, as I mentioned, you do public improvements, you issue bonds. The bonds are paid back by special assessments, and the special assessments are levied on the properties in the basis of their benefit. So if you're doing a new street overlay, you might do it on a linear foot basis. If you're doing, if you're doing sewer, it might be something similar to that. But think public improvements, this is a way to kind of finance that, and then just in how much benefit does somebody get from it. There are some procedural steps involved in the formation. That's the stuff that I walk you through, and we talked about the NID bonds already. So what are the potential uses for NIDs? Property acquisition, streets, curbs, gutters. Again, kind of think public improvements. You can do waterworks, street lights, parks, playground facilities, all kinds of flood control measures, bridges and overpasses, landscaping, improving even public safety in some of those areas. So there's some neat uses of NIDs, but again, when you suggest a NID, you're asking the people to pay for it themselves. What you're doing is you're providing a financing mechanism for you. It's a very low interest municipal rate borrowing for a period of 20 years that you're setting up for them, but they're paying for it for themselves. Moving now to Chapter 100 tax abatement. So we've kind of moved now at this point kind of out of the more retail entertainment type uses to stuff. This starts to get into the first industrial manufacturing, okay? I say that, but I'm also going to give you a caveat that it doesn't have to be used that way. So where do we find the authority for Chapter 100? Surprisingly, it's in Chapter 100. 100.010 to 100.200 is where we find it. But what I will tell you is That's the General Assembly's picture of industrial development bonds as an incentive tool in Missouri. The real authority for this is actually found in the Missouri Constitution. The Missouri Constitution provides for tax abatement for commerce, okay? And so while the General Assembly has focused Chapter 100 on industrial and manufacturing type projects, as long as your project is being, kind of is staying in the path of commerce, you can utilize Chapter 100 for it. So what's an example of that? If I told you that you could use industrial development bonds to build an apartment building, be like, what's industrial about that, right? Doesn't sound right. Well, when you build an apartment building, as long as the apartment building or condos or whatever it is that you're building, your residential living units, as long as they are intended to be continued by the project owner to be something that they will lease out and they're keeping it in the vein of commerce, right? Then it can be used. Now, if a developer's just building it to sell off to people and truck on and develop something else, then that's not considered in the vein of commerce, right? But if the person seeking the incentive in this case is going to keep it, something that they're constantly renting out in your community, you have a better chance of being able to use the Chapter 100 bonds. And so we've seen more and more of these in recent years. The city's bond counsel has historically been Gilmore and Bell, and they were, that's a firm that I used to work at, back in the day, and we work hand in glove with them on a lot of things because they're bond counsel where we're economic development counsel, and so the projects that we start kind of end up, with them when the bonds go get issued, and so they've been, really instrumental in kind of pressing this concept really over the last, 5 and 10 years. And we're really starting to see it catch hold, especially as TIF was changed by the General Assembly and made a little bit more difficult to use. We're starting to see more and more and more projects now where the applicant is just coming in at the beginning saying, I'd like Chapter 100 and a sales tax reimbursement agreement, and they don't have to mess with the expense and the time of TIF. And it's been working, really well. And so we can use Chapter 100 for all kinds of different projects with respect to that. So we'll talk about some of the concepts here in Chapter 100 to spend a little bit of time on that. So this again, so remember, I'm using the statutory authority, so that's Chapter 100. It focuses on just really kind of more the industry and the manufacturing, stuff like that. But you can do, apartment complexes, and you can do grocery stores and other types of projects as long as they're in commerce. So, maybe I have to step back here. Okay, actually it's in these smaller bullet points right here. So the concept, how Chapter 100 works is, it is a tax abatement tool, okay? So when you think about property tax, think about the fact that when you get a tax bill every year, you actually, you'll get a statement from the county that gives your assessed valuation, and what will it talk about? It'll talk about what your land is worth. It might talk separately about what your improvements to the land might be. It'll also talk about what? Your personal property, right? Your, cars and boats and, things like that, right? And so these three concepts are in play for the abatement on Chapter 100. We look at those three elements. And so when a applicant is coming forward to you and they're asking to use tax incentives, what they're essentially saying is, I want to sell you some of my property. While you own it, it is what? Tax exempt. When the city owns it, it's tax exempt. So if it's tax exempt, how much is the abatement for the owner? 100%. 100% abatement. Right? We following along? Okay, so when someone comes to you and they're looking for this incentive, we're gonna talk with them, we're gonna say, okay, well, what is the incentive that you need? How do we go about doing it? What do you want us to own? Because in the end, we're gonna do essentially this really complex agreement that is a buy-sell agreement, and they're gonna sell the property to us. The contract's gonna say at the end, we have to sell it back to them. They're going to get it back. And depending on what it is that we own, that thing will be be tax exempt because the city owns it. It's 100% abatement to them, okay? Well, the very first example I ever used is when I was at Gilmore and Bell. We represented the city of Springfield, happens to have a Kraft manufacturing plant there. And Kraft came to the city, and at that time they asked, because they wanted to, do an additional industrial line, a new line in their factory, right? So in that circumstance, do you know what kind of property that line would be? The line itself is personal property, right? So is the freezer or refrigerators in a grocery store, the shelving units in a grocery store, things like that. So you clicking with me here? So when Kraft wanted to buy this new $1 million, I don't remember how much it was, but $1 million industrial line in the city, they came to the city and said, we'd like to get tax abatement on this to help us offset the cost of doing this. And, the amount that they didn't have to pay in taxes, was enough to, that it made sense for them to do the project and expand and create more jobs in Springfield. Now, if you drove by the outside of the Kraft plant, do you think, did it say anywhere property of the city of Springfield? If you think you walked past the line in the plant, did it have like Springfield city limits right on the machine itself? No, it did not. No way in heck anybody even knew that the city of Springfield owned that line for the period that it did. Right? And what I will tell you is, just like that example, if you do a deal like this, the city of Branson might ultimately own, the freezers or the refrigerators in a grocery store. They might own the building itself, or the land, the building, and the refrigerators, right? The real estate, the improvements, or and the personal property. And when they do that, it's tax exempt, and that's a benefit to the people coming in to, build, whatever the thing is. It could be an industrial plant, like a grocery store. It could be, like whatever, right? If you're doing furnished apartments, it could be the beds and the tables and the chairs, that are in the apartment that, you're providing to seasonal workers that could come in. Is that something we talked about yesterday? So, that's something that you can utilize, from that standpoint to do that. Now, so we talked about the fact that, what if the applicant comes in and says, yes, I want you to own the land, the building, and the personal property. How much property tax is that property going to produce if it's all, if we own it all?
0.
Could that be a little too rich of, 100% abatement on that? It might be. So what can we do? This is like your question. So in the lease purchase agreement that we end up doing, which is essentially the redevelopment, agreement that we're used to in other phases, we can put the terms in there to say that the city will own, all these pieces of property, but applicant, we're going to set your, in the other thing, I guess, I'm sorry, I forgot. I have to cover this real quick. The financing for whatever is bought, built, and so forth, is done through industrial development bonds. Okay, so we go out, typically, what I'll tell you, this is kind of another one of those legal fictions you got to kind of go with me on, is typically the company itself that is asking for the incentive will buy the bonds. Essentially, they're loaning money to themselves, okay? It's a very close sale. Or they may come to the table with their bank already, and the bank says, we're going to buy the bonds. It's not even going to go to market, okay? But that's the financing structure. As a part of what the city does then is we own the property. We're going to do what, right? We're going to become landlords. Who's our tenant? The company. Well, what do landlords collect from tenants? Rent. Guess how much the rent is? It's equal to the debt service payment on the bonds to reimburse the deal, right? So the bonds are covered, and the city's getting the money to pay for those because it's getting paid the rents, okay? Now, and in the meantime, because the city owns the property, the company is not having to pay property taxes. So in that lease purchase agreement where we lay out the rents and we lay out when we're going to buy it, when we're going to sell it back, and we're doing all that stuff, we can also put a clause in there that says, oh, and by the way, yes, we're going to own it all and you're going to be tax exempt, but that's way too rich. So what we're going to tell you is you're going to have to pay a 50% pilot on all types, or 25%, or 50% on land, 10% on on personal property, you know, whatever combination you want, you can write into the agreement to make sure then that property taxes are flowing to the city and all of the other taxing jurisdictions as well. So remember, the considerations. Think about your other taxing jurisdictions that you're affecting when you do this, school district being, you know, one of the biggest ones. When we do a Chapter 100 project, we should really think about doing pilots, right? Every time we talk about paying pilots, what are we doing? We're reducing the amount of incentive that the applicant gets, right? And so the whole policy, everything we've been talking about for 2 nights is this. How much do you open the flow and how much do you close it? When do you decide to make the flow as full as possible and when do you narrow it down? That is your policy. It is what you set for goals. So if you want student housing for people who can come here and, you know, but don't live here all year round, this is a way you could potentially do that, is using a Chapter 100 project to pay for housing that maybe is furnished housing. Does that make sense? So many other uses for it, but that's an example. Okay.
It all kind of sounds sneaky legal.
It's not sneaky legal, it's creative.
Okay.
Hey, Joe.
Thank goodness for smart lawyers because we can find ways to bring the things that you need to your community, right?
Joe, since you had that last part, and I've been curious, I've had a question all night. You've been laying out for 2 days brilliantly what we can say yes to. Do we have full discretion to say no?
Absolutely, and exercise it, right? That's the other piece I'm talking about, though, you know, because I'm talking about how wide you can open the spigot, right? You know, you got the fire hose and it's cranked all the way back and you're flopping around, right? Or you shut it off, right? You decide when to shut it off. And what you should do in your policy is you should make it clear to everybody before they even walk in the door whether their project is going to get the full fire hose or a dribble. Right? You should know that. They should know that when they walk in the room. How do they know that? How does Alex know? How does anybody in your community development department know when an applicant comes in and asks them what to do? How do they tell them, how do they give them advice as to how to proceed with the city? Because you guys don't do the day-to-day and you never should. You set the policy. This is it right here. This is the big picture we've been talking about since August. This is you guys saying, our city is here today. We want to be here in 30 years. In order to get there, we've got to plot this course out. These are the things that we need to be successful 30 and 50 years from now. Staff gets started on it tomorrow, once we get the policy in place, right? Because then an applicant can go at midnight, they get a stroke of genius, and they want to go find out what Branson would offer. They can go to your website and pull down your policy and understand what you're looking for, what you're willing to pay, and whether their stuff matches up or not. This is why we do what we're doing.
So it begs the question, are we ever at a liability as a city because either we gave one to this person and not to this person, or if our set policies, we're going against what we've set our policies at, right, if we say no?
So the answer to the question is this. All incentives are completely discretionary. Whether someone brought you the same exact project 15 minutes later or not, but you just granted it, you can say no to the person 15 minutes later. Where do you have liability? Where do we always have liability as a city? Did you tell them no because they were a woman? Because they were a person of color? Because of their marital status? Those are where cities incur liability. If we're making decisions that violate people's civil rights, I'm going to do something I never do. I'm going to tell you, you should get sued over that. Okay, but we don't do that here. But you have absolute ability from a discretionary standpoint to say, we got what we needed, we're moving on. I don't care that your thing is similar or the same or whatever. Somebody already did it. The box is checked, move on to the next opportunity. We have 3 other things on our list. Have at it. That's why you do the policy, though, because if you don't, where's the ball?
Yeah.
How does somebody that comes in, how do they know
That's right.
whether the box has been checked or not if you didn't create the box in the first place?
Thank
Well,
you.
I think what you're saying, though, I mean, you may not be liable, but would that feel good? Sure, I know what you're saying. You know what I mean?
You set the expectations with a good policy. People will understand. And if they don't, that might be just their hurt feelings. Sorry.
How much more do you have to go through?
Very little.
Hey, Joe, real quick, speaking of liability,
Unless I get a bunch of questions, but
I just
please
got
ask.
one more.
I'm just-
In reference to
it's from
chapter
Ralph of
100,
all people.
I mean, this is good stuff, right? It's worth it.
are there clearly defined, is it outlined as to the level of liability since the city owns the property? How is that structured in there?
It's like anything else for the city. Cities in Missouri have sovereign immunity, so to the extent that we own something, we're liable up to the amount of insurance that we purchase, which is capped by the state. We're very structured in Missouri as to what we can do on that. If there's a dangerous condition on property that is not addressed, the city, sovereign immunity is waived in that circumstance. But there, in the end, keep in mind, it's still the company's property. I mean, it's our property, but the company's got full possession of it, so they're gonna be responsible, and we're gonna make them get insurance for it and carry us as a second, as another named party on it, so that if something happens, we're covered. That's what I get to do. Okay, talked about the eligible projects already. We talked about performance agreements, lease purchase. We can also put clawbacks in these. So if a company comes to you and says, hey, we got this great idea, we're gonna do this, and we're gonna bring you 300, new jobs that are, 10% above the county median, and then when it's all said and done, they bring in 150 jobs that are right at the county median, we have language in the agreement that says, you know what? You didn't do what you delivered, and so we're gonna reduce down your abatement as a result. So that's another way of, doing that, even when you have a deal on the table, because we put it in the contract. We talked about pilots already. 353, moving on to that, urban redevelopment corporations. I told you before, this is the granddaddy, the daddy, the big brother or whatever of TIF. This is a blight remediation tool. It is a tax abatement only. There's no sales tax abatement in this one. Blight is required on this one to be utilized. You bring a 353 plan forward. There's a public hearing just in front of the Board of Aldermen. You guys make a decision on that. The way this one works is for the very first 10 years that a plan is in, up to the first 10 years, there can be up to a 100% tax abatement for the improvements and the increase in value of real property, exclusive of improvements. And then once that 10-year period is over, for up to the next 15 years, after that initial 10-year period, there can be at least 50% abatement, which means it can be from 50 to 100% abatement at that time, okay? You should read the statute. It makes my eyes cross. I still have a note that I did for like 12 years ago where I had to write it all out just so I could understand how the statute reads, just to be able to say that. It's maddening. One of the tools I have seen, so 353 is like I told you before, TIF is for really big projects for blight abatement, but if you've got that small community, that small, rifle shot project, 353 is probably better for it. It's way less expensive to create. It's not nearly as burdensome. It's easier to work. And you can do all kinds of combinations. One of my most recent projects, and actually probably the 353 project I'm the proudest of, the city of Harrisonville, Missouri, around their historic square, Harrisonville had a mix of commercial properties and also residential properties. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to encourage people to invest in their property. And so from the homeowner side of things, they wanted them to invest in the beautification of their home. And so they said, if you property owners will invest X amount, you would qualify for a 353 abatement program. And they have this program that we just created where if they make a certain investment, then they can get abatement over a period of time at a certain percentage. And you can play all over, any sorts of, ways to do that. But because it was a mix of commercial and residential in that area, we also created a second tranche of it where if commercial properties would invest in certain things and invest a certain amount, they got a benefit as well. And so the goal for Harrisonville in that circumstance is they want the property, because their square is one of those that right now is in the process of revitalizing. It was owned by one guy for years and years and years, and he had a big beef with the city and hated the city, so he just sat on the properties and let them go defunct, essentially. It was like went to deterioration. You know, actually heard a state rep one time say sometimes you're only about 3 funerals away from success. You know, unfortunately, this guy died, and when he did, the properties, his family sold the properties off, and now they've got all this amazing nightlife on their old historic square, some really cool things, you know, restaurants and coffee shops, and people are coming down to the square and doing all kinds of cool stuff. And the city said, hey, let's build on this synergy, you know, let's get other properties to reinvest in their properties, and let's get some of the homeowners around here to reinvest. And they use 353 to do that. So that's, you know, another idea. If that ends up being one of your goals, we have a way, you know, I've got a plan that we could modify for you guys to make it work here. Sales tax reimbursements agreement. Sales tax reimbursement agreements. You guys just went through this. I don't need to cover this in a lot of detail because that's what the Philcrest project was about. So essentially, it's the same statute that authorizes the city to enter into like a mutual aid agreement between fire departments or police departments, you know, that if something happens, our guys are busy, our guys and gals are busy someplace, they'll cover for us, and if they're busy someplace, we'll cover for them. It's intergovernmental cooperative agreements, don't have to just be with governmental entities. They can be with private entities as well. And so you can use a sales tax reimbursement agreement to use city funds, okay? Now, the critical piece, right, we learned all the way back to TIF about the TIF special allocation fund, the washing machine that lets you spend on anything TIF, right? But the non-captured piece of the sales tax revenues has to be used on city stuff, right? Only what the city is authorized for. So if it's a parks tax, only parks. If it's capital improvements, only capital improvements. If it's transportation, only transportation, right? General fund, anything that is a public benefit. Okay, and we talked about public benefit. So you can use sales tax reimbursement agreements to, and one beauty of a sales tax reimbursement agreement is what taxing jurisdiction is affected? Just the city, right? You're not saying what the county's tax or the school district's tax or whatever. You're being good neighbors from an incentive standpoint on that. But it's limited, right? You can only utilize it for things that the city could pay for. Now, what did we talk about the Kelo case? Economic development is a public purpose. He's trying to help you get all the gold stars tonight. Economic development can be a public purpose, so you can use general fund revenues for that. Now, you can't use transportation for economic development, right? Doesn't work that way. And unfortunately, we don't have, a whole lot of economic development sales taxes. There are a few out there, but your public safety tax, not something that can be used. Your marijuana sales tax, not something you can use, things like that. So, so sales tax reimbursement agreements can be good, but, one of the first questions you should ask an applicant is what's the public benefit, right? And hopefully what they'll say is that they had to, there was, something out there that, they had to put a new turn lane in, or they had to put a stoplight in, things that we can pay for as a city, that would be their impediment to developing, right? And we would say, because you had these impediments to developing in the city of Branson, then, we're willing to give over some money, okay? So it was last night, or was it tonight, earlier, it was last night. I was talking to a developer in Kansas City about the potential of doing a project down here in Branson. And they said that one of the things that they're always worried about is what? Rock. Okay. Well, rock is something that we have here that might, be unique, not completely unique, right? We're all on a rock, the whole, planet's a rock. But, there's more rock here than there is, maybe in Ozark, Missouri, or, in other places where people could develop. So if that is something that we need to overcome as a city, then maybe as a part of your policy, you make a declaration that it is a public benefit to encourage economic development activities that are otherwise hindered because of the existence of rock in the community. And maybe we create some standards that would say, you know, you have to have done some sort of core samples, or we have to have proof that the rock is there before they even come in, right? But they've looked at it and they said, we were gonna build on this site, but we can't do it because it's gonna be so expensive to blast it out. Maybe you guys create something in your policy that says we will give some additional incentive in the form of a sales tax reimbursement agreement to help overcome rock, you know? Going real quick, I should have mentioned it before, and maybe you guys already picked up on it. When I was talking about the 353 stuff, you know, the neighborhood redevelopment, that's a perfect way to do that business. You know, if you want to do a program for businesses to reinvest in their businesses, and, you know, maybe it's a little bit smaller scale, or you can scale it down to smaller projects, that 353 is a great way to do that. So, you know, now, you wouldn't put that program in your policy, but you would set up a policy that would say, you know, one of our goals is to create a program to allow for small businesses to reinvest in their businesses by utilizing 353. And then staff now, we have direction to say, okay, we need to develop a program where businesses could come in and apply to utilize some sort of some sort of property tax abatement in order, you know, to offset costs of them reinvesting in their business. Okay, that's one way we could do that. There's others. We could do sales tax reimbursements. We could do a lot of other things. But if your goal is to help small businesses reinvest, you know, do that, right? If your goal is we have infill, we have vacant properties, you know, we want to open the spigot wider for people who are going to do, you know, replace a business that is falling down and is just nasty looking and is an eyesore over one that's just a flat lot right now or a green space, right? So these are, again, those are those considerations of what is your priority? How do you want to hit this? How do we want to go about creating programs then that will do what you want to do? But set those goals first.
I'm sorry. Let's say a local business owner wants to purchase a building that's been sitting there for 5 years, start up a new business, and he's going to do a $3 million infill, right, with this new business. The everyday Joe, no pun intended, is not going to know. They're not going to. If they come down to the city and say, "Hey, I've got this plan. I'm $1 million short. How could the city?" Is that something that staff will go, "Well, here's." They'd look through all these different things. This is what I would recommend here. Maybe we look at the sales tax, or we look at the 353. Is that something that they would recommend and point that business owner in the right direction? Not to say that they would automatically get it, but the ordinary person's not going to know all these.
So there are a couple levels to the answer to this question, right? One of the levels of this question is, it's why we're here tonight. Did you know about this stuff before, Alderman Cooper? No. Do you know about it now? If someone comes to you and says, how could the city help me? What would you be able to say? At a minimum, what would you be able to say?
I would say a pilot is property tax and eats is sales tax.
And then,
Thank you.
And then you would say, please come in and talk to city staff because we've got a whole palette of economic development tools, and it sounds like one of the things that you want to do meets one of the goals that we set for ourselves, you know, back in February of 2024, right? That it starts with you, because why? You are elected to represent your constituents. Up here, divided amongst you, is the interests of 12,000 plus people in this community. And you set the stage for the, 20 million visitors you get a year? Is that the number in there?
That's pushing it, Joe.
Okay. Well, it should be. Okay, 10 then. Okay, you set the stage for that, right? It starts with you, but when you set the policy to take that forward, then you empower your staff to do things, right? You can put money in your budget that says, we need a small amount of money set aside to market our economic development. You've already got Jonas who's been in this community for almost, 15 years or almost 20 years, I think. He's the guy that's been out selling this community for you, but I feel like to some extent you guys, don't know him all that well. We should, make sure that people, Jonas is empowered, and he is empowered to go out and spread the word, because he's out spreading the word to people beyond the community, okay? And then internally to the community, we should be doing things as a city to market. I see your commercials every morning when I'm working out at home in Lee Summit, right? Market in your community to people so that you don't ever have a situation where they said, I didn't know. It should at least be the case where they didn't know because they were hiding under a rock, at that point. So there's no reason that people shouldn't know. These things have always been available. You guys have had an economic development policy. The one that I have has been in place for over 10 years at this point. They've been there. I'm not telling you anything new tonight or last night, other than we need new goals.
But, yeah, you're right. It's up to maybe us and the city, but most people don't know that.
It is incumbent to some extent on good business people to understand how to do good business, and that includes finding financing sources for the projects that they dream up and that they want to achieve. They don't have to do it all themselves. They know that because they already know to go seek out a loan. They might go seek out a federal, small business SBA loan or, other types of financing options. And as a part of that, their mantra should be, I should check with my local community to see if they're doing anything, right? Now, maybe we're not all naturally, innately, destined to kind of come up with that. But if you do your part of marketing that and driving people to staff to ask the questions, then you're going to solve a lion's share of it. We can't solve all the problems of the world.
Oh, no, I agree. I mean, putting the word out, yeah, for sure.
Yep.
I'm not disagreeing with that at all.
I don't think you are.
Hey, Joe, because it's come up a couple times, I'm just curious, if we wanted to, like, under this type or any of the types, if we wanted to exclude the tourism tax from the abatement, how would we go about doing something?
I think you flat say the tourism tax is not on the table. I think somebody suggested that last night. It might have been Gail Myers. It shouldn't be on there. And again, the tourism tax should be limited to, bringing new tourists, So if it is on the table, then you should make an applicant prove to you why it will bring new visitors to the city, not just be a different place for visitors who are already coming here to go to, right? There's a difference. So if we want 10 to become 15 or 20, then we should incentivize that. But we also have to have a way to quantify that it will happen.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
I'm feeling before our next meeting, I'm feeling we need an additional meeting. I think we need to talk about priorities. I think the majority will agree one of our priorities needs to be, we need to address our workforce housing, right? But I think we need to have some discussion of what those priorities are. We can't do everything, right? What's most important, what directly affects us today, workforce housing, clearly. Workforce housing will provide such an economic benefit to our community because we'll have more employees to provide services, whether it's at restaurants or cleaning hotel rooms or whatever all the needs are that we can't fill, right? But I know the plan was we were going to have a meeting last night, a meeting tonight, regurgitate this, and look at our February meeting. Do you agree that until we can move forward, we need to decide on where our priorities are and then attack those?
I agree with you. I don't know that you need me here for that. I'm happy to be here for it, but here's what I will tell you. The last community I did this for in December, they got to the same exact point and they had the same exact discussion. They said, you know what? We feel it now. We understand what we have to do. And what they decided to do was they did like a town hall meeting or an open house, or they did something like that, where you bring people in and you have that, and you maybe have a work session where you guys hear it, but actually do some work on that. Or maybe you guys get together, you'd have to do it in a public meeting, right? No closed session.
Yeah.
But you get together in a public meeting, discuss that, start to rough out what you think your priorities are, lay out a list, and then take that to the public meeting and say, do you constituents agree with us on this? Here's some dots. Put it against the stuff that you think is most important.
So
Or some
Alex,
other way.
if you would do that, and then bring us a proposal of how we can take all the eats and neats and beats for affordable housing, right? Something simple, half page, we can approve by our next Board of Aldermen meeting.
Absolutely, Mayor. And, that the affordable housing piece is something we've actually worked with a few developers in town on to develop. A few projects have kind of surfaced, and what we've done is worked with them to try to provide some type of incentive, whether it's utilities, infrastructure, stormwater, et cetera. So we've already been thinking about those issues pretty heavily. But to codify it in this manual update, I think would be very, very helpful.
The question from Brian Stallings is, have we defined what affordable housing is? I believe Jonas just updated recently our housing update. Jonas would be an excellent resource to be involved in this, for sure.
Are you talking about like a specific,
Dollar
this amount
amounts?
to this amount? What is that line?
Yeah,
Yes, that's a. Yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
And rents, right?
Rents, yeah.
Is 600 affordable, is 900 affordable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great question.
yeah. What valuable stuff this is, isn't it? And I'll tell you,
Can you tell I love this stuff?
yeah, I said this last night, I'll briefly say it again tonight. Our community is so fortunate to have this kind of caliber, right? Who's been there, done that, and providing us direction and guidance.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that was impressive.
Got fired up at the end. I liked that part.
Are there any brief comments? I know Joe needs to go. Are there any brief comments? Is it brief and is it relative? And if it is, jump up to the microphone, please.
I have two questions directly for you.
State your name for people.
Michael
listening.
Phillips, Branson, Missouri. One of my favorite sections is chapter 353. On this one, my question directly pertains to, in blight, what is the time frame that a city is looking at to determine blight? And can 353 be used in acquisition of demolition projects that are currently going on?
So I think your question was like, how long does it take to make a blight determination? Actually, it really doesn't take that long necessarily. And our firm does provide those services. So we have worked with some of our communities to do the blight study that was required in order to do a 353 project. We can usually knock one of those out in 4 to 6 weeks, maybe even less. So, and our cost is actually really low on that, just, a couple $1,000 really. I mean, it varies on the size of the project. We did the one for the city of Harrisonville. I think it was like $5,000 and it was 120 properties or something like that. So, and that one might have taken a little bit longer because it was so big. We just did one recently for the city of Sedalia. I think it was about 3,500 or 4,000, and it was, somewhat less properties, stuff like that. So then your question was, can you use 353 for demolitions? Yes, as long as you have the blight finding first, because it's a blight remediation tool. Sometimes remediating blight involves removing the property altogether and building something new there, so that would be a fine use of 353.
Gail? No.
Well, he's asking priority discussion.
Oh, you know what? Let's save it. And
Okay.
And shortly, Alex, I'd love to have a meeting. Just for that, because I think that'll be a lengthy discussion. I think we really want to hear input. You agree with that, board? Yeah.
Larry, they actually did it for the 76 CID. They had like a charrette, with things, with the poster boards up and.
I was
and
there,
going
yeah.
around.
Yeah, it was awesome, yeah. At the lodge, yeah.
Did you have any quick comments you wanted to make?
Well, the only thing we have not talked about that I would ask you to think about is, one of your priorities should be transportation. And you're gonna get this convention study. I can already tell you pretty well what it's gonna say. It's gonna say the biggest barrier is transportation, and transportation between here and Springfield, as well as workforce. And then the other side of it, that won't be in the study, is workforce transportation. And you're dead on. It's housing. And I was sitting up back there thinking about the whole hero part of this. And I think the hero part is housing, transportation, and then you guys continue to say 76 is the project. Okay, so let's see if we can focus on that, those three things. Because he did a great job, right? He did a great job.
Yeah.
But he's also got 17 items, and you guys can't handle that. I think you got to focus on no more than four real initiatives. So you just let me give you input, and I appreciate that. So.
Thank you, Gail. We always appreciate your input.
To add on to Mr. Meyer's, comments is, you might have 17 that you identify, but that's why you prioritize. You come up with the 3 or 4, and maybe that's the difference between, remember what we talked about, short-term, midterm,
Yeah.
long-term. And maybe that's exactly how you set up your priorities. And as you knock stuff off the list, they're gonna rise. And new things that you never thought of might pop up.
That's right.
And you have to figure out where to put those. This is not, don't you dare do this policy and put it on a shelf.
That's right. This is a living
This is a
document.
living, breathing document that, we talked about handing a baton before. Now we're gonna hand a book over with the policies. It's the football. It's like, whatever the president passes on with the nuke codes in it or something, that's what you're creating to pass on to the new boards that succeed you.
That's a lot of pressure. It's kind of elevated.
It's important.
I truly appreciate you listening, those online that are listening, the communications. I've received several emails from last night's meeting, good stuff. I think we're on the right track. I do believe the next several meetings we can have in your absence. We can't afford you anymore, right? And if you're done talking, I need you to clock out.
Can't afford not to have me. We gotta
It's
build this sales
it's
tax
8:50, I need you to clock out, he bills by 10-minute increments. Invaluable. Board, any quick wrap-up comments?
Just very quickly, Mr. Mayor, I think when we talk about that one, the 353, the smaller one for individual businesses, I think we want to keep in mind that was sort of the impetus for a lot of this discussion tonight. So putting that into place and letting people know that have been to that microphone right there over the next month or so is going to be a really crucial part of this. Not just thinking long-term, maybe that's one of the short-term ones, so.
You guys are gonna tell us what to do on that.
Yeah. Anybody besides Ralph want to share any short comments? Alex?
In closing, of course, if anyone has any comments on priorities or this process, please visit our website, contact your alderman. In addition, we have set up public comment at bransonmo.gov. So please feel free to provide a written comment there that will be made available to the public and, of course, to the board. And those comments are, of course, super valuable as we shape these policies. Thank you.
Ruth?
I just wanted to thank Gail for your comment regarding transportation. We were having this discussion last night afterwards, and with the workforce housing, not everyone just lives in Branson. They come from other areas, so thank you for that.
Good job. With that, do I have something to follow here? Board, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
We have a motion, second and third. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Don't have to scream it. Opposed, same sign. Ayes have it. Thank you sincerely.